Before Motown took over the 1960s, there was a building on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago. Two immigrant brothers ran a record label out of it, and inside those walls, they built the entire blueprint Berry Gordy used to dominate American music. The in-house songwriter model, the session musician machine, the gospel to pop crossover, the vocal group system. They called it Chess Records. Ten artists built that blueprint, and most of them never got full credit for what Motown took from them. Tonight, we fix that. Number 10, Little Walter, Juke, 1952. His real name was Marion Walter Jacobs. Born in Louisiana in 1930, started playing harmonica on street corners at 11 years old, arrived in Chicago as a teenager, and by the time he was 22, he had done something nobody had ever done before. He turned the harmonica into an electric lead instrument, not a background texture, not a folk novelty, a full-blown electric voice that could cut through a band the way a saxophone did, or a guitar. The way he did it was simple, but nobody had thought of it. He held the harmonica directly up to a bullet-shaped microphone, the kind used by DJs at the time, and cupped his hands around both, creating an airtight seal. The result was a distorted, wailing, amplified sound that had never existed before. It was the first recorded use of what we now call amplified harmonica technique, and Chess Records captured it on tape in 1952 on a track called Juke. Here is what makes Juke historically staggering. It was recorded as the B-side of a Muddy Waters single. It was not supposed to be the main event. It was the throwaway flip. But when DJs started playing it, the response was immediate. Juke hit #1 on the Billboard R&B charts and stayed there for 8 weeks. The B-side became the hit. The session musician had become the star. That concept, that the people in the room making the music were just as important as the names on the marquee, is something Chess pioneered and Motown institutionalized. Berry Gordy built his entire Funk Brothers session musician system on exactly that principle. The idea that a core house band playing together on every single record creates a sound bigger than any one artist. Little Walter proved it first in 1952 in a recording studio on the south side of Chicago on a song that wasn't even supposed to be a single. Number 9, The Moonglows, Sincerely, 1954.
To the one that you love, and let us.
The Moonglows, a vocal group from Louisville, Kentucky, discovered by Alan Freed, the legendary DJ who coined the term rock and roll, and signed to Chess Records in 1954. And at the center of that group was a man named Harvey Fuqua, whose story connects Chess Records and Motown in a direct, documented, undeniable line. Sincerely was the Moonglows' breakthrough hit for Chess in 1954, a smooth, polished, harmony-driven doo-wop ballad that climbed to #1 on the R&B charts. The song was so successful that the McGuire Sisters, a white pop group, covered it almost immediately and took much of the mainstream sales thanks to radio segregation at the time. But the Moonglows original remained a landmark of black vocal group craft. Layered harmonies, call and response structure, an emotional vocal lead surrounded by a perfectly arranged chorus. It was a formula, and it was the formula Motown would later perfect with the Temptations, the Miracles, and the Four Tops. Here is the direct connection. Harvey Fuqua, the lead voice and architect of the Moonglows, eventually dissolved the group and moved to Detroit in the early 1960s. Berry Gordy, recognizing exactly what Fuqua knew about vocal group arrangement and artist development, hired him directly. Fuqua became one of Motown's key producers and artist development figures, working with Marvin Gaye, Tammy Terrell, and several other Motown acts throughout the 1960s. He also married Gwen Gordy, Berry's sister, deepening the family connection. The vocal group harmony architecture of Motown, that thing where a lead voice floats above a perfectly arranged background, where every part serves the song, where polish and emotion coexist. That architecture was built at Chess Records with the Moonglows. Harvey Fuqua carried the blueprint from 2120 South Michigan Avenue directly into Hitsville, USA. Number 8, Bo Diddley, 1955. Bo Diddley, Arthur Ellis Bates McDaniel, born in Mississippi, raised in Chicago. And in 1955, he walked into Chess Records and handed Leonard Chess a single that did something no artist had done before. He put his own name in the title of his debut record. Not a song about love, not a song about the blues. A song called Bo Diddley, introducing himself, his rhythm, and his persona as one inseparable package. That was his first release, and it went to number 1 on the R&B charts immediately. Bo Diddley called her nanny goat. The rhythm he brought with him, what became known as the Bo Diddley beat, is built on a syncopated, shaking, Afro-Cuban influenced pattern that sounds nothing like anything else in American music at the time. Chuck Berry described it simply as the beat that won't stop. It runs through Bo Diddley, Who Do You Love, Mona, I'm a Man, and dozens of other records. The Rolling Stones built entire songs around it. Buddy Holly used it on Not Fade Away. It became one of the most borrowed rhythmic patterns in all of rock and roll history. But here is the Chess Records angle that almost nobody talks about. Leonard Chess paired Bo Diddley with a steady house band, a core set of session musicians who played every Chess session. And that stable rhythm section is what gave the Bo Diddley beat its locked-in, unmistakable groove. The same people, the same room, the same chemistry, record after record. That is the session musician system. That is the studio as instrument concept. And Leonard Chess was running it years before Berry Gordy formalized it with the Funk Brothers in Detroit. Gordy also studied something else from Bo Diddley specifically, the idea of building an artist's entire identity around a sound. Diddley was his beat, his guitar shape, his name, his persona, everything cohesive, everything intentional.
Take my baby away from home.
At Motown, that concept became the art of artist development, the tailored wardrobe, the choreography, the defined sound per artist, the cultivated identity. Chess did it first with the artist who put his own name in the song. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 7. Howlin' Wolf, Smokestack, Lightnin, 1956. Chester, Arthur Burnett, born in White Station, Mississippi in 1910. 6 feet 3 inches tall, 275 pounds, with a voice that could shake a building. Sam Phillips discovered him in Memphis, the same Sam Phillips who discovered Elvis Presley, and sent his Chess Records masters to Leonard Chess in Chicago. Chess heard the first recordings in 1951 and immediately understood what he had. He reportedly told staff, "This is where the soul of man never dies." Smokestack Lightnin came in 1956. It is built on a single hypnotic chord that does not resolve for the entire song, just a rolling, churning, almost terrifying groove that sustains 4 minutes without flinching.
Whoa, stop your track.
Wolf's vocal on the track sounds like it is coming from somewhere physically deeper than a human chest. A sound musicologist, Greil Marcus, once called the most frightening voice in the history of the blues.
Oh, don't you hear me cry?
The song is skeletal and immense at the same time. No chorus, no verse-chorus structure the way pop music defined it, just the riff, the vocal, and the feeling. And the feeling is what Chess could capture and Motown would study from a completely different angle.
You hear me cry? Ooh.
Because Motown looked at what made Howlin' Wolf connect with an audience. The absolute, overwhelming physical commitment of the performance. The sense that the singer was not performing so much as being taken over by the music. And asked how that could be translated into a form that mainstream radio would play without flinching. The answer was Marvin Gaye.
I've been gone.
It was the Four Tops Levi Stubbs, whose voice carried the same desperate urgency on different subjects. The emotional intensity of Chess blues, filtered, polished, and pointed at the pop charts.
You know more, don't you hear me cry?
The British invasion groups, the Rolling Stones, the Animals, Led Zeppelin, went directly to Wolf for inspiration and made no attempt to hide it. They loved the rawness. Motown took the emotional DNA and built a house around it. Both approaches lead back to the same building in Chicago. Number 6, Muddy Waters, I'm Your Hoochie, Coochie Man, 1954. McKinley Morganfield, born near Rolling Fork, Mississippi in 1913. Arrived in Chicago in 1943, began recording for Chess in 1950. By 1954, he had already placed 10 songs on the R&B charts. But nothing in his career up to that point prepared anyone for what happened when Willie Dixon brought him a new song in the men's room of the Club Zanzibar during an intermission one night in 1953.
I got a mojo too.
Dixon ran the lyrics past Muddy standing right there in the bathroom. Waters liked what he heard immediately, got his guitar, and practiced the song on the club stage that same night. He had never seen the words written down. Dixon later said Waters ran it 2 or 3 times that evening. 5 weeks later, on January 7th, 1954, Waters brought his full band into Chess Studios.
You girl, lead me by my hand.
Guitarist Jimmy Rogers, pianist Otis Spann, Dixon on bass, Fred Below on drums, and Little Walter on harmonica, and recorded I'm Your Hoochie Coochie Man in one of the most important sessions in the history of American music. The song's stop-time arrangement, where the entire band drops out except for a single riff repeated between vocal phrases, had never been used this dramatically before. The tension it creates is almost physically uncomfortable in the best way possible. And the moment the full band drops back in for the chorus, the release is overwhelming. It became Waters' biggest hit, spending 13 weeks on the Billboard R&B charts. NPR called it a keystone in the architecture of rock and roll. The Library of Congress added it to the National Recording Registry. But the Motown connection runs even deeper than musical influence. Willie Dixon's model, one chief in-house songwriter who writes specifically for individual artists' strengths and public personas, who tailors material to each voice and each character, is exactly what Motown replicated with Howlin' Dozier Howlin'. Write for the artist, know the voice, build the song around the person. Dixon did it for Waters, for Howlin' Wolf, for Little Walter. Howlin' Dozier Howlin' did it for the Supremes, the Four Tops, the Temptations. The Chess songwriting system was the original blueprint. Number 5, Chuck Berry, Johnny B. Goode, 1958. Charles Edward Anderson Berry, St. Louis, Missouri. Drove up to Chicago in 1955 on Muddy Waters' advice. Way back up in the woods among the evergreens, there stood a log cabin. Waters had told Berry the Chess brothers would treat him fairly and auditioned for Leonard and Phil Chess with a song he called Ida Red. The Chess brothers liked it, but asked him to change the name. He changed it to Maybelline. It became his first top 10 pop hit. He never looked back. Go, Johnny, go, go. Johnny B. Goode, released in March of 1958, is the most fully realized distillation of everything Chuck Berry had been building since Maybelline. Guitar as the lead voice, doubled bass notes carrying the boogie-woogie piano tradition into electric string territory, lyrics that turned the story of a self-made musician into the most universal myth in rock and roll. The kid from the country who makes himself famous through raw talent alone. The riff is borrowed in some form by virtually every rock guitarist who followed. The song has been in space. NASA included it on the Voyager Golden Record in 1977 as one of humanity's representative musical achievements. But Berry's Chess Records contribution to the Motown story goes beyond musical influence. Berry Gordy's very first successful national hit, Bad Girl by the Miracles in 1959, was distributed nationally by Chess Records. Someday your name will be in lights saying Johnny B. Goode. Chess was literally the pipeline through which Motown's first records reached the country. Gordy leased the master to Chess because Chess already had the national R&B distribution network that Motown hadn't yet built. Someday your name will be in lights saying Johnny B. Goode tonight. Smokey Robinson later convinced Gordy to build Motown's own distribution, making the label independent. But in the beginning, without Chess Records' infrastructure, Motown's first hit might never have had national reach. Willie Dixon also used to make Berry practice Johnny B. Goode 40 times in Chess Studio B before allowing him to record it across the hall in the main studio. 40 times. The discipline of repetition, the rehearsal process baked into the recording session. That was Chess Records culture. And it is also Motown culture, where artists rehearsed choreography, diction, and stage deportment before they ever stepped near a microphone. People coming from miles around to hear you play your music. Number 4, The Dells, Oh, What a Night, 1956.
Do you recall the night that
The Dells, from Harvey, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. They formed as a high school group in 1952, signed to Chess's Checker subsidiary in 1955, and released Oh, What a Night in 1956.
what a night?
The song is a slow-burning doo-wop ballad built on a bass lead vocal surrounded by tightly stacked harmonies. And it is an almost perfect example of what great vocal group arrangement sounds like. It hit number 4 on the R&B charts and established the Dells as one of Chess's most important vocal acts. But the story of the Dells is not just the story of one hit. The Dells survived a car accident in 1958 that nearly destroyed the group, returned in the mid-1960s, reinvented their sound entirely in the late 1960s with producer Charles Stepney, and crossed over to the pop mainstream with lush orchestral soul arrangements. They are one of the longest-running and most stylistically resilient vocal groups in American music history, active in some form from 1952 all the way into the 1990s. The Dells represent a Chess Records principle that Motown took to heart more deliberately than almost any other. A vocal group is more than a hit record. It is a long-term entity that must evolve or die. Berry Gordy spent enormous effort on The Temptations specifically, keeping the group coherent through personnel changes, multiple production styles, and shifting cultural contexts, because he understood that a vocal group's longevity was itself a kind of asset. There is also a direct sonic connection. Charles Stepney, the Chicago arranger and producer who reinvented the Dells sound in the late 1960s at Cadet Records, was working with orchestral strings, horns, and complex chord changes in ways that mirrored what Motown's own arranger Paul Reiser was doing simultaneously in Detroit. Two parallel currents fed by the same Chicago blues and gospel tradition, arriving at lush orchestrated soul from different directions. The Dells were there first, and Chess Records was the lab where Stepney worked it out.
One more night.
Number 3, Ramsey Lewis, The In Crowd, 1965. Ramsey Lewis Trio, Chicago-born jazz pianist, signed to Chess's Argo Jazz subsidiary, later renamed Cadet, who achieved something in 1965 that almost nobody in jazz had managed before, a genuine mainstream pop crossover hit built entirely around instrumental jazz piano. The In Crowd is a live recording captured at the Bohemian Caverns in Washington, D.C. in May 1965. No overdubs, no polish, just Lewis at the piano, L.D. Young on bass, and Red Holt on drums, recorded in front of a crowd that you can hear reacting in real time throughout the song. The audience response, the clapping, the cheering between phrases, is baked into the record itself. It became part of the arrangement, and that decision to release a live performance complete with crowd noise rather than cleaning it up for studio release gave the record an energy and spontaneity that studio recordings of the era simply couldn't replicate. The In Crowd climbed to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100, won the Grammy for Best Instrumental Jazz Performance in 1965, and sold over 1 million copies. Ramsey Lewis had crossed jazz into pop without compromising a single note of what jazz actually was. The Motown connection here is conceptual but direct. Berry Gordy had a jazz subsidiary of his own, Workshop Jazz Records, established in 1962, not because he thought he could sell jazz records, but specifically to attract the best jazz musicians in Detroit to play on his pop sessions. He made a promise, record for my pop label, and I'll give you an album release on the jazz label. The musicians he recruited this way became the core of the Funk Brothers. Chess Records, under the Argo and Cadet imprints, was doing the same thing, using jazz credibility to anchor a roster that also included blues, soul, and R&B. Ahmad Jamal, Gene Ammons, and Ramsey Lewis gave Chess a prestige layer that proved the label could do more than one thing. Motown studied that multi-label, multi-genre architecture and replicated it almost perfectly. Tamla for R&B, Gordy for pop soul, Workshop Jazz for prestige. The Chess template is unmistakable. Number 2, Etta James, At Last, 1960. Jamesetta Hawkins, born in Los Angeles in 1938, discovered by Johnny Otis as a teenager, signed to Chess's Argo subsidiary in 1960, and in that same year, she walked into the Chess studio at 2120 South Michigan Avenue and stood in front of a vintage microphone roughly in the center of the room and sang At Last. It became one of the most celebrated vocal performances in American music history. At Last is not a Chess original. It was written in 1941 by Mac Gordon and Harry Warren, recorded first by Glenn Miller. But what Etta James did to it in that Chicago studio in 1960 is what the Chess session musicians and producer Billy Davis understood how to unlock. She didn't sing it, she inhabited it. The orchestra arrangement, the way her vocal swells from intimacy to full power without ever losing control, the specific warmth of the Chess recording itself, with its distinct room sound, it is a document of a voice doing exactly what it was built to do. The song has never left American culture. It has been played at countless weddings, film scenes, pivotal television moments for 6 decades. And it was produced at Chess Records by the same Billy Davis, who had co-written Lonely Teardrops and Reet Petite for Jackie Wilson, alongside Berry Gordy just a few years before. Davis had left Gordy's orbit, walked across the street, metaphorically, to Chess Records, and in his Chess years produced Etta James, Fontella Bass, Little Milton, and Mitty Collier. He was building Motown-style crossover soul at Chess, simultaneously, with a roster Gordy never had access to. Here is the specific thing Motown took from Etta James and Chess Records. The idea that a black female vocalist with a gospel-rooted, emotionally overwhelming voice could cross over to mainstream American pop, not by softening herself, but by being fully, completely herself in the right arrangement. That is Diana Ross. That is Mary Wells. That is Martha Reeves. The blueprint for the Motown female voice was written at Chess Records by Etta James in 1960. Number 1, Fontella Bass, Rescue Me, 1965. Fontella Bass, born in St. Louis in 1940 into a deep gospel family. Her mother, Martha Bass, was one of the most celebrated gospel singers in America. Fontella grew up singing in church, learned piano, toured with gospel acts, and eventually found her way to Chess Records in Chicago, where she was signed to the Checker subsidiary label in the mid-1960s. And there, under the direction of producer Billy Davis, the same man who had previously co-written Lonely Teardrops with Berry Gordy, she made one of the defining records of the decade. Rescue Me was written by Carl Smith and Reynard Minor, reportedly partially sketched out during a rehearsal break right in Chess's Studio B, the same room where Willie Dixon had once made Chuck Berry practice Johnny B. Goode 40 times. The session that produced the final recording featured the Chess House Band at their peak. Charles Stepney on vibraphone, Pete Cozy on guitar, the horn section that appears on dozens of Chess records throughout the 1960s, and Fontella's voice sitting on top of all of it, like she owned every inch of the building. Bass reportedly recorded her vocal in a single take. Rescue Me hit number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in November 1965 and went to number 1 on the R&B charts. It was Chess Records' first million-selling single since Chuck Berry's peak in the 1950s. And the timing is crucial. This was exactly the period when Motown was producing its most dominant run of hits. The Supremes, the Four Tops, the Temptations, and right in the middle of it, Chess Records. The older, supposedly past its prime label puts out a record that goes gold and tops the R&B chart. The reason it worked is the reason Chess worked at its best. A gospel-trained voice, a precision house band, a producer who understood both the soul tradition and the pop market, all working in the same room, chasing the same feeling. Billy Davis left Chess for an advertising agency in 1968, and within 2 years, Chess Records had been sold, with much of its creative energy gone. But what he built at Chess with Fontella Bass, Etta James, and Little Milton is the fullest proof that the Chess Records blueprint and the Motown blueprint were, at their core, the same blueprint. One called it the blues, the other called it the sound of young America. The building where they both started was at 2120 South Michigan Avenue, Chicago.